My son called me from the Baton Rouge Parish Prison at 11:40 at night and asked me to come bail him out. I was in bed. I had been asleep for 2 hours. The phone on the nightstand showed his name, and I looked at it for a moment before I answered, because in my 67 years on this earth, I had developed a fairly reliable sense of what certain phone calls cost before I picked them up, and this one had the weight of something expensive. I answered anyway. He said, "Dad, it's Darren. I need you to come down to the jail. I got picked up tonight, and I need you to post bail." I said, "What happened?" He said, "It's complicated. I'll explain everything when you get here. Just please come. They're saying I can be out in a couple hours once bail is set." I sat up in bed. The room was dark and still, in the particular way that rooms are still at that hour in South Louisiana, heavy and humid, even with the air running. I said, "What did they pick you up for, Darren?" A pause. The particular pause of someone calculating what to say rather than deciding whether to tell the truth. He said, "Financial stuff. It's a misunderstanding. I'll explain everything. Please just come, Dad." "Financial stuff." I said, "I'll be there in 30 minutes. I got dressed. I made a cup of coffee because I was 67 years old, and I was not about to drive across Baton Rouge at midnight without coffee. I stood at the kitchen counter and drank it slowly, and I thought about the word misunderstanding, which is a word that people use when they need to describe something accurately, without describing it accurately. I had spent 31 years in the insurance business. I had reviewed more misunderstandings than most people encounter in a lifetime. I knew what the word meant when someone used it to describe why a police department had their phone. I finished the coffee. I drove to the Baton Rouge Parish Prison on Airline Highway. I parked in the visitor lot and walked through the glass doors into the intake area at 12:20 in the morning. The officer at the front desk was a heavy-set man in his 40s with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the expression of someone who had been doing this work long enough to have stopped being surprised by most of what walked through those doors. He looked up when I came in. I told him my son Darren Ostrander had been brought in and that I was here to discuss posting bail. He said, "Name?" I said, "Raymond Ostrander. I'm his father." He typed. He looked at the screen, and then something happened that I had not expected and that I would spend the next several hours understanding. He went completely still. Not a pause, not a hesitation. A full physical stillness, the kind that comes when a person's eyes are reading something that their brain is taking a moment to process. He looked at the screen for 3 or 4 seconds longer than the information should have required. Then he looked up at me. Then he looked at the screen again. He said, "Excuse me one moment, sir." He picked up the desk phone. He said something into it that I could not hear. He set it down. He said, "If you could just have a seat over there, sir. Someone will be right out to speak with you. Someone will be right out." I sat down in a plastic chair against the wall and I looked at the fluorescent ceiling of the Baton Rouge Parish Prison intake area at 12:20 in the morning, and I felt, for the first time since I had gotten off the phone with my son, the particular cold current that runs through a man when he understands that what he came to handle is much larger than what he was told he was coming to handle. 17 minutes later, a door opened beside the intake desk, and a woman in plain clothes walked out. She was in her late 40s, wore a dark blazer over a gray shirt, and had the economical, unhurried movement of someone accustomed to rooms like this, at hours like this. She walked directly to me. She said, "Mr. Ostrander, I'm Detective Sandra Boulware, Financial Crimes Unit. Would you come with me, please?" Financial Crimes Unit. I stood up. I followed her through the door. She brought me to a small conference room with a table and 4 chairs, and a whiteboard with something written on it in red marker that had been partially erased. She set a folder on the table. She sat down across from me. She said, "Mr. Ostrander, I want to ask you something before I show you anything. When was the last time you reviewed your bank accounts? All of them, checking, savings, any investment accounts you have with your institution." I looked at her steadily. I said, "I reviewed them 6 weeks ago. That is not a coincidence, and I think you already know that." She looked at me for a moment with an expression that was recalibrating slightly from where it had started. Then she reached into the folder. She set a photograph on the table in front of me. It was a security camera still, the kind that banks keep above the ATM vestibule, time-stamped and slightly grainy in the way of those images. It showed a man at an ATM machine. The man was my son. She said, "Mr. Ostrander, do you know what your son has been doing with your accounts?" I looked at the photograph. I looked at my son's face in the grainy camera still, and I thought about the word misunderstanding, and I thought about the 31 years I had spent evaluating risk for a living, and I thought about my wife Helen, who had been gone for 18 months, and who would have known the shape of this before I ever picked up the phone. I said, "I have a very good idea. I think you're about to tell me the rest of it." She said, "Yes, sir, I am." And that is the moment this story really began. My name is Raymond Ostrander. I am 67 years old. I live in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and what my son did not know, when he called me from that jail at 11:40 at night asking me to come bail him out, was that I had been waiting for exactly this conversation for 6 weeks. Welcome to True Story. Hit that subscribe button and drop your city in the comments. We read every single one. Now let's get into it. I spent 31 years as a branch manager and regional supervisor for Gulf Coast Mutual Insurance, a mid-sized property and casualty insurer headquartered in Metairie, Louisiana. I started as a claims examiner in 1981 right out of LSU, worked my way to branch manager by 1989, and by the time I retired in 2019, I had been overseeing a 5-state regional operation with 42 agents, 2 satellite offices, and a claims portfolio that ran north of $200 million annually. Insurance is not a business that rewards naivety. In 31 years of evaluating claims, I learned to read the distance between what a person says happened and what the documents say happened, and I learned that the distance is rarely zero, and sometimes very wide. I am not a cynical man. I am a precise one. There is a difference. I was also, for 33 years, the husband of Helen Marie Ostrander, born Helen Marie Thibodeau in Breaux Bridge, Louisiana, in 1954, who was the most morally clear person I have ever known, and who taught 7th grade science at Belfair Middle School, in Baton Rouge, for 24 years, and who approached the world with a directness that I found bracing and right, and that I have missed every single day since March of 2022, when she died of ovarian cancer, in the bedroom of our house on Rosedown Drive, with both of our children beside her. Helen and I had a daughter named Leslie and a son named Darren. Leslie was 39, lived in Houston where she worked as a nurse practitioner at a cardiology group, called me on Tuesday and Thursday evenings and on Sunday mornings without being reminded or asked, and drove over from Houston twice in the months after Helen died to spend the week cleaning and cooking and sitting with me in the evenings on the back porch, the way you sit with a person who does not need to be entertained, but does need to know they are not alone. She had her mother's directness and her mother's steadiness, and she had been telling me for 2 years, in the careful way that a direct person delivers a careful message, that something about Darren was not adding up. Darren was 36. He lived in the Shenandoah neighborhood of Baton Rouge, with his wife Tanya, and their son Marcus, who was 5. He worked in what he described as sales consulting, which was a description elastic enough to mean almost anything, and which I had eventually concluded meant something in the vicinity of nothing very stable. He drove a truck that was newer than his income should have supported. He wore clothing that cost more than it looked like it cost. He ate at restaurants in Mid-City and the Garden District that he paid for on a credit card, that he also described, when I once asked about it, as a business expense. Darren called me on Sundays, not every Sunday, the Sundays when he needed something. He was warm in the way that people are warm when they need the room to like them. He asked after Helen long after she was gone, and in the asking always managed to pivot, gently and naturally, toward a question about finances, or the house, or what I was planning to do with my retirement accounts in the current market. He had borrowed money from us 4 times between 2016 and 2021. $14,000 in 2016 for what he called a business investment, $8,000 in 2018 for what he called a temporary shortfall, $22,000 in 2020 for what he called a situation with the house that needed to be handled quickly. $11,000 in 2021 that he described as a bridge loan between two consulting contracts. Total, $55,000 over 5 years. He had repaid exactly $8,000 of it, the 2018 amount, 6 months after borrowing it. Nothing else had been repaid. Helen had tracked every dollar in the notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer, the same notebook where she tracked her students and her garden, and the birds she spotted, and the things I said that she wanted to keep. She had a page for Darren's loans. When she died, I had found it during the estate paperwork and sat with it for a long time. I had also found a different page, a page dated November 2021, 3 months before she died, with a short entry in Helen's handwriting that said, "Raymond, check the secondary account. I don't recognize 2 of the recurring transactions. I think Darren may have access we didn't authorize." I had not checked immediately. I had been managing her illness, and then her death, and then the aftermath of her death, and I had filed the notebook in the drawer where it always lived, and I had not looked at that page for 11 months. I looked at it in February of 2023, and then I checked the secondary account, and then I sat at the kitchen table on Rosedown Drive for a very long time. The secondary account was a savings account that Helen and I had maintained jointly since 1994 at First Federal Bank on Perkins Road. It was not our primary account. It was the account we had used for specific things over the years: home repair reserves, vacation funds, the kind of savings that a household keeps separate from operating money, because separation is how you keep it from being spent. When Helen died, the account held $94,000. In February 2023, it held $31,200. $62,800 had been withdrawn or transferred in the 18 months since Helen's death. I had not authorized any of it. I had not been aware of any of it. The account was in both of our names, and Helen was gone, and I had not checked it closely, because I had not had reason to believe I needed to. I looked at the transaction history. 41 separate transactions over 18 months, ATM withdrawals in amounts between $400 and $600, always at machines in neighborhoods I did not frequent: Shenandoah, Mid-City, the stretch of Florida Boulevard between I-110 and the Target. Online transfers to an account number I did not recognize. A recurring monthly transfer of $1,200 that had begun in September 2021, 3 months before Helen died, which told me the access had been established while she was still alive and too ill to monitor things closely. I did not call Darren. I did not call Leslie. I called the bank. I spoke with a woman in the fraud department named Deborah Fontenot. She was 44 years old, had been in bank fraud investigation for 16 years, and had a voice on the phone that was the sound of someone who has heard every version of the story I was telling her, and has never once been surprised by how far it goes. She listened to everything I said. She asked me 4 specific questions. She told me to come into the branch the next morning and bring 2 forms of identification. I came in the next morning. I brought my driver's license and my passport, and the statements I had printed the night before with the transactions highlighted. Deborah reviewed everything at a conference table in the back office of the Perkins Road branch. She was quiet for most of it. When she finished, she looked up at me and said, "Mr. Ostrander, I need to ask you something directly. Did you give anyone a signed authorization to access this account, or your account number, or any associated credentials?" I said no. She said, "Did you share your online banking login with anyone?" I said no. She said, "Has anyone had access to your physical mail, or to documents in your home that might contain account information?" I thought about that. I thought about Darren visiting after Helen's death, helping with paperwork, going through files in the study. I thought about the account statements that arrived by mail, because Helen had preferred paper, and I had never changed the delivery preference after she died. I said, "Possibly." She said, "Mr. Ostrander, this is the pattern of an account that has been accessed by someone who obtained your credentials through physical means, either from your mail or from documents they had access to in your home. The transaction pattern is consistent with deliberate, sustained account exploitation rather than a one-time incident." I said, "What do I need to do?" She said, "I'm going to recommend we open an internal fraud investigation. We'll close the compromised account and transfer your balance to a new account with new credentials. And I'm going to ask you, if you have any knowledge of who may have done this, to consider filing a police report. Because, Mr. Ostrander, this isn't a small thing. $62,000 over 18 months is not a mistake. This is a course of conduct. I said, I need some time before I decide how to proceed. She said, I understand, but the investigation starts today on our end regardless. We'll be in touch. I drove home. I sat in the driveway of my house on Rosedown Drive for 15 minutes before I went inside. I sat there and I looked at the house that Helen and I had bought in 1998 and that she had filled with plants she named and furniture she had argued for, and the particular objects that accumulate in a house over 25 years of a life lived with intention and care. I thought about what she had written in November 2021. Check the secondary account. I don't recognize two of the recurring transactions. She had known. She had been too sick to act on it herself, and she had written it down so that I would find it when she was gone. Even at the end, even from her bed, she had been watching and recording and leaving me what I needed. I went inside. I made a cup of coffee. I sat at the kitchen table, and I began making a list of every transaction I could associate with a date on which Darren had been in contact with me. Every Sunday call, every visit to the house, every piece of mail that had arrived during a period when he might have had access. I worked on the list for 6 weeks. I documented everything. I built a transaction map with dates and amounts and locations and everything I could cross-reference against my own calendar and phone records, and the security camera on the front door that I had installed in 2021, because the neighborhood had been having package theft problems. 6 weeks, and then my son called me from the Baton Rouge Parish Prison at 11:40 at night and asked me to come bail him out. Detective Boulware spread 4 photographs on the table in front of me. The first was the ATM, still I had already seen. The second was a transaction printout showing 17 withdrawals from my secondary account over 6 months, each one at an ATM within 2 miles of Darren's house in Shenandoah. The third was a copy of an application for a personal line of credit at a lender in Metairie, submitted in my name with a forged signature, approved for $35,000, fully drawn, not repaid. The fourth was a copy of a business credit account application submitted in the name of Ostrander Consulting LLC, an entity I had never formed, listing me as the principal, opened in 2021, with $22,400 in outstanding charges. Ostrander Consulting LLC. I looked at that document for a moment. The name of a company that did not exist. My name on the filing. A business I had not created, used to accumulate debt that I had not authorized. I looked up. Detective Boulware was watching me with the particular expression of an investigator who has delivered this kind of information before and has learned to read the moment when the full scope of a thing becomes real to its recipient. I said, "How long has your unit been looking at this?" She said, "We received a referral from First Federal Bank approximately 6 weeks ago. Deborah Fontenot's investigation." I said, "And the Ostrander Consulting LLC. When was that opened?" She said, "November 2021. November 2021, 3 months before Helen died, when she had been writing notes in her notebook from her bed because she was too ill to do anything else. When Darren had been coming to the house to help with what he described as paperwork and logistics." I said, "What is the total exposure?" She said, "Currently documented, the secondary account withdrawals total $62,800. The personal line of credit is $35,000. The business account outstanding is $22,400. There is also an auto loan in your name for a 2021 truck, approximately $31,000 remaining balance, that we believe financed the vehicle your son is currently driving." I sat with that for a moment. I did the math. $151,200. Rounded conservatively. She said, "Mr. Ostrander, I want to be direct with you. Your son was picked up tonight as part of a separate matter. He was detained after attempting to use a credit card that had been reported stolen. The card was not yours. During processing, his name appeared in connection with our ongoing fraud investigation, which is how your name flagged at the desk when you came in. What we have built over the past 6 weeks is a substantial case. But your cooperation, and specifically your documentation, will be critical to what happens next. I said, I have documentation. She looked at me. I said, I have been building a transaction map for 6 weeks. I have dates, amounts, ATM locations, cross-referenced against my phone records, my calendar, and the security camera footage from my front door camera, which captures my mailbox and my front walk. I have it on a flash drive. Detective Boulware was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Mr. Ostrander, you came prepared. I said, I spent 31 years in insurance. Preparation is not optional. It is the job. She said, do you have the drive with you? I said, I do not. I have it at home, and I have a copy in a fireproof lockbox in my workshop, and I have a second copy uploaded to a cloud account that I am the only person with access to. Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise exactly. Something closer to professional satisfaction. She said, I would like to schedule a formal interview at our office tomorrow morning. Would 9 o'clock work? I said, 9 o'clock works fine. Then I said, Detective, my son asked me to come here to bail him out. I'd like to know what you would recommend I do about that. She looked at me for a moment, the careful look of a law enforcement officer choosing her words within the boundary of what she could properly advise. She said, that is entirely your decision, Mr. Ostrander. I can't tell you what to do. What I can tell you is that the investigation we're conducting has its own timeline, and your son's presence in this facility tonight is not a complication for that investigation. I said, I understand. She said, he can remain in custody until his arraignment Monday morning. Bail will be set then. I thanked her. She walked me back to the intake area. I nodded to the officer at the desk, who watched me with the particular expression of a man who had seen the beginning of a story and was now watching the middle, and I walked out into the Baton Rouge night. The air outside was the thick, warm air of a Louisiana night in late spring, the smell of the river somewhere east, and the highway, and the particular night-blooming things that grow along the Gulf Coast that Helen had always known the names of, and I had never bothered to learn. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for a few minutes. The lot was lit by sodium lights that turned everything a particular shade of amber, and the highway beyond the chain-link fence was quiet at that hour, except for the intermittent sound of passing trucks. I did not call Darren back. I did not go back inside. I started the truck and I drove home to Rosedown Drive, and I made myself a drink, which I almost never did at that hour, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I looked at the chair where Helen had sat every morning for 23 years, with her coffee and her notebook, and her particular quality of seeing things precisely as they were. I said to the chair, I found it, Helen, the way you knew I would. I finished my drink. I went to bed. I arrived at the Financial Crimes Unit office on Mayflower Street at 8:50 the next morning. I had the flash drive in my jacket pocket and a printed summary of my 6 weeks of documentation in a folder under my arm, and I had slept exactly 5 hours, and I felt, in spite of that, entirely clear. Detective Boulware met me in the lobby. She brought me to an interview room where a second detective, a younger man named Carl Thibodeau, was already seated with a laptop and a legal pad. We spent 3 hours in that room. I walked them through everything: the February discovery, the Deborah Fontenot conversation at First Federal, the 6 weeks of building the transaction map, the security camera footage I had reviewed showing Darren's truck in my driveway on 4 separate occasions between Helen's death and my February discovery, on 3 of which occasions I had not been home, which I could establish because my own vehicle was absent from the driveway in those frames. Carl Thibodeau typed steadily and said very little. Detective Boulware asked precise questions that told me she had already done significant work before I walked into that room and was using my information to close gaps rather than to open lines of inquiry. At the end of the 3 hours, she set down her pen and said, Mr. Ostrander, your documentation is the most organized victim contribution I have received in 14 years in this unit. I said, I was building a case. I knew that's what it would need to be. She said, Why didn't you go to the police 6 weeks ago when you first discovered the account irregularities? It was a fair question. I had asked it myself several times. I said, because 6 weeks ago I had evidence of account access that was unauthorized, but that I could not yet prove with certainty was my son, rather than some third-party breach. I needed to build the chain of evidence before I accused a specific person, and I needed to know the full scope before I acted, because partial action would have tipped him off and I would have lost whatever came next. She looked at me for a moment. She said, "That is a risk. Giving someone time to continue a fraud in order to build a more complete case is a risk. More money can move." I said, "I know. I decided the risk was acceptable given what I was building toward." She said, "What were you building toward?" I said, "Toward a case that doesn't let him minimize it. That doesn't let an attorney argue it was a one-time mistake or a misunderstanding or a family arrangement gone complicated. I wanted 18 months of transactions and 3 fraudulent financial instruments and a security camera establishing physical presence at the point of access. I wanted something that couldn't be explained away." Carl Thibodeau looked up from his laptop. Detective Ballware said, "You got it." I called Leslie that afternoon. She was between appointments when she answered, and I could hear the background sound of a medical office behind her. I told her everything: the account, the fraud investigation, the jail call, the detective, the photographs, the Ostrander Consulting LLC that Darren had opened in my name in November 2021, while her mother was dying in the next room. She was quiet throughout, in the way she is quiet when she is listening, with the whole of herself. When I finished, she said, "Dad, the truck." I said, "I know." She said, "He drove that truck to Mom's funeral. He drove it to the house after. He parked it in the driveway of the house where she died, and he had bought it with a loan in your name." I said, "Yes." She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "Cooperate fully with the investigation, not post bail. Let the process determine what happens next." She said, "Mom knew, didn't she?" I said, "She wrote it in her notebook in November 2021. She left me the page." I heard Leslie exhale, the sound of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and has just been told that the weight of it is exactly as heavy as they thought. She said she was driving over Friday. I told her to stay at the house. She asked if I was sure. I said her mother's plants needed watering and I had been getting it wrong. She laughed, the laugh that sounds like Helen's laugh, and said she'd be there by 7. The Friday that Leslie arrived was also the Friday of Darren's arraignment. He had sat in the Baton Rouge Parish Prison from Saturday night to Friday morning. Tanya called me on Sunday evening asking why I hadn't posted bail. I told her to get a lawyer before Monday. She said, "Raymond, he is your son." I said, "I know. And what he did is also what it is. Both of those things are true at the same time." She cried. I stayed on the phone until she stopped. I told her Marcus was my grandson, and that would not change. Then she hung up. I sat at the table and thought about what a case file looks like when it cannot be managed. $151,000, 18 months of ATM footage, 3 fraudulent financial instruments, and a bank investigation running parallel to my own. That was going to go where the evidence pointed. Darren was arraigned Friday morning. Identity theft, fraudulent use of financial information, obtaining financial instruments by fraud. Bail set at $50,000. Tanya posted it. By 7:15 Friday evening, Leslie came through my front door with a bag over one shoulder and a container of Zydeco's red beans and rice from the place on Plank Road that Helen had loved. She set it on the counter and looked at me the way her mother used to look at me when there was nothing useful left to say, and presence was the correct offering. She said, "How are you doing?" I said, "I'm functional." She said, "Is that different from okay?" I said, "Right now, yes." We ate dinner at the kitchen table. We talked about the case, and about Marcus, and about Tanya, and about the parts of this that had no good outcomes, only less bad ones. We talked about Helen and the notebook, and the page from November 2021, and what it meant, that she had known and had found the way to tell me, from across the 18 months that separated her death from my discovery. At some point, Leslie said, "She trusted you to find it." I said, "She trusted me to be thorough. Those are the same thing for me." Leslie looked at the windowsill plants. She said, "The pothos is getting too much sun. It should be moved to the other window." I said, "I knew something was wrong with it." She stood up and moved the plant to the east window and stood back and looked at it. She said, "Better. She'll be fine." She was not talking only about the plant. I understood that. The criminal case proceeded over the following 8 months. I was interviewed 3 more times by Detective Boulware, and once by an assistant district attorney named Philip Joubert, who was methodical and specific, and had a particular quality I respected in lawyers, which was that he spoke to me as though I was capable of understanding the legal process if it was explained clearly, which it turns out I was. What the investigation established, fully and documentably, was this. Between September 2021 and February 2023, my son Darren Ostrander had used account credentials obtained from documents in my home to make 41 unauthorized withdrawals from my secondary savings account, totaling $62,800. He had forged my signature on a personal line of credit application at a Metairie lender and drawn the full $35,000. He had formed Ostrander Consulting LLC, using my social security number and personal information, and had used the resulting business credit account to accumulate $22,400 in charges. He had financed a 2021 pickup truck in my name, using a fraudulent loan application, with a remaining balance of $31,000. Total documented, $151,200. He had done all of this, in part, during his visits to the house in the period of his mother's illness and death, when the household was in a disruption that made financial monitoring difficult, and when documents containing sensitive information were accessible in ways they would not ordinarily have been. The part I found hardest to hold was the timing. Not the total amount, though the amount was significant. The timing. That the access had begun in September 2021, while Helen was alive and bedridden, and receiving visits from her son, who came to help with paperwork and logistics. That the first fraudulent credit application had been submitted in November 2021, the same month she had written her note in the notebook. That the account draws had continued without interruption through her death in March 2022, and for a year afterward. I had learned, in 31 years of insurance work, to evaluate claims in terms of the risk calculation behind them. What was the probability that an event was what it appeared to be? What was the probability that something else was happening? I had evaluated my son's behavior against that framework many times since February. The results were not ambiguous. The pattern was deliberate. It had been deliberate from the beginning, and it had been calculated, in part, on the assumption that I would not look closely, that grief would provide cover, that a 67-year-old widower would be less precise than he had been for the preceding 3 decades. He had known me his entire life, and had made the wrong calculation. Darren entered a guilty plea in October. The agreement with the district attorney's office included full restitution, 5 years of supervised probation, and a suspended sentence with the provision that any violation of the probation terms would result in immediate incarceration. Philip Joubert had pushed for more. I had told him that the restitution and the record and the supervised probation were what I wanted. I wanted the money, because it was mine, and I wanted the record, because I wanted what had happened to be something he could not explain away or minimize, to any employer or lender or future partner, for the rest of his professional life. Philip had said, "That's a reasonable outcome, Mr. Ostrander. Not everyone in your position would be that measured about it." I said, "I spent 31 years evaluating what people were owed and what was reasonable. It does something to how you think about these questions." The restitution payments began in November, structured monthly over a period of years that I will not see completed in a time frame I feel particularly optimistic about. The truck was surrendered as part of the agreement. Darren called me the week after the plea. I answered. He said, "Dad." I said, "Darren." He said, "I don't know what to say." I said, "I know." He said, "I'm sorry. I know that's not enough." I said, "No, it isn't." We were quiet for a moment. He said, "I didn't mean for it to go this far." I said, "Darren, a pattern of conduct that begins in September 2021 and continues for 18 months is not something that happens by accident or escalates beyond a person's intentions. You made a choice every single time you entered a PIN number that wasn't yours. You made a choice every time you signed a document with my name on it. Those were choices, not escalations." He was quiet. He said, "I know." I said, "Marcus is my grandson. My relationship with him is not changing. My relationship with Tanya is not changing, inasmuch as she was not part of what you did. My relationship with you is something I'm going to have to figure out over time, and I'm not going to make a decision about it while the restitution is not yet started and the probation has not yet been tested." He said, "That's fair." I said, "I think so." We talked for a few more minutes. It was an uncomfortable conversation, and it was the right conversation, and those things can be true at the same time. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a while. I thought about the night I had driven across Baton Rouge to that jail parking lot and sat in the amber sodium light and understood that what my son had called me to handle was much larger than what he had told me. I thought about Detective Boulware setting the photograph on the table and asking me if I knew what my son had been doing with my accounts. I thought about the flash drive in my jacket pocket that I had built over 6 weeks from Helen's notebook entry, and a secondary account statement, and a particular stubbornness about documentation that I had developed over 31 years, and that had served me, in the most personal possible way, exactly when I needed it to. I thought about Helen's note. Check the secondary account. She had seen it from her bed. She had written it down with the specific intention of leaving it for me to find after she was gone, knowing I would find it, knowing I would do what needed doing with it. That was the inheritance that actually mattered, not the money, the note. The money was mine, and I intended to get it back, all of it, over however many monthly payments it required. But the note was something else. It was proof that the 33 years I had spent with that woman had made me someone she trusted, to see things clearly when she no longer could. That is not a small thing. That is the largest thing. Leslie comes over on alternating Fridays now. She corrected 3 more of the plants on her second visit, and 1 on her third, each time standing back and looking at the adjusted placement the way her mother used to stand back and look at things she had just set right. The pothos is doing well in the east window. The snake plant on the counter has put out a new shoot. I have been reading the notebook Helen left to understand what she intended for the others. I am not a man who dwells. I am a man who documents, evaluates, and decides what comes next. What comes next, in most respects, is ordinary life. Coffee in the morning. The river visible from the Rosedown Drive end of the street at certain angles in the early light. The birds Helen could have named and that I am beginning, slowly, to learn for myself. I built a career on knowing what the documents say when the story and the documents diverge. My son counted on the grief to make me less precise than that. He was wrong. If this story stayed with you, drop a comment below and tell me which moment hit you the hardest. Hit that like button, subscribe if you are not already here, and I will see you in the next one. True Story uploads every week. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss one.